Hi, Identity Crisis listeners. I'm Tessa Zitter, the producer. As Yehuda shared in a recent Identity Crisis episode, due to the war with Iran, Hartman's summer program plans went through significant change, as many of our programs were no longer able to take place at our beloved Machon in Jerusalem this summer. While this loss is felt deeply throughout the entire Hartman community, we are still doing our best to bring you a taste of our summer programming wherever you may be. On Thursday, June 27th, our community leadership program gathered for a virtual session with Yehuda Kurtzer and Barry Finestone on the challenges of leadership in this time. This week, we're sharing that important conversation with you. Enjoy the episode.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being with us here tonight. For those of you who are intended to be with us in person in Jerusalem, there's quite a bit of pathos around this. And I have to say, putting on this virtual background of the Institute in Jerusalem is not helping. It's a nice look on a photograph, but it makes us feel a little bit even more distant from the cool summer evening that we were hoping to spend together. Thanks as well to our Identity Crisis listeners. Thanks for joining us for this conversation. You know, part of what makes this moment particularly challenging, I will say personally, is knowing that the flights have reopened. I'm sure that some of you, I appreciate that none of you emailed me about this. Of like, quick, if we don't go to the airport now, we could be there in person. I'm not sure that the backpacks were fully ordered. I mean, I'm not sure we'd be able to pull it off. But it does feel like, in theory, we could be in CLP in person in Jerusalem right now. And as you know, we had to make fast and agonizing decisions last week in real time based on rapidly changing circumstances with very little ability to see around the bend. I don't think there was any way to know day one of the war how long this would go, much less that the war would end on day 12, and by day 13, daycares and elementary schools in Israel would be open once again. I mentioned to a group that I spoke here in DC last night that there's a Jewish traditional idea called Isru Chag, which is that a day after a holiday, it's not quite a holiday, but it's kind of a recovery day. And I have friends in Israel who said, don't we get like an Isru war day, like a day in between war and real life? And I know many of us feel that whiplash. When I'm looking back at that experience, it was as trying a time that I feel like I've had as a leader in an organization. And in a crisis, this was a crisis that demanded so much change, a flurry of consequential decisions that implicate a lot of people, many of you who hope to travel in Jerusalem, the hope of doing a program like this in person. The habit of having to get good at making decisions in periods of crisis is obviously something that is considered essential to Jewish leadership. At the same time, it's not always clear that being good at that makes you a good leader in general about other things, given the fact that what we want out of our leaders is sometimes decisive action in moments of crisis. And oftentimes we also want the wisdom of deliberative action, not just in moments of crisis, but at other times. And one of the risks that you have is you get addicted to the kinds of work you have to do in periods of crisis that makes you incapable of leaning into the other kind of moment of leadership that is deliberative, that crisis might not help. Much as the way we know that sometimes great war leaders are not great peacetime leaders, and vice versa. As always, in moments of crisis, as Tammy mentioned at the outset, this represents a moment for us to think about the work of leadership more generally, the state of our work in the Jewish community, the state of our field, the state of our people in this confusing time. So this is a different way than I intended to open a conversation with my dear friend and colleague, Barry Finestone, the president and CEO of the Jim Joseph Foundation, who's joining us from San Francisco. But it is a useful prompt to actually think about many of the same issues that we wished to talk about. I think our initial intention was to talk about Jewish leadership at this moment in Jewish history. Now we get to add on in response to this particular moment in our recent past. So let's start in that place. Let's talk a little bit about the challenge of leadership in crisis. You have worked, Barry, and first of all, thanks for being here. And I promise you a return visit to get to do this in person in Jerusalem. The hard part is not canceling flights. The hard part is creating clarity about mission, purpose, and values in moments of crisis. And I want to start with your own reflections about your own experience as a professional leader in Jewish communal institutional settings, and now on the other side of the table in the world of philanthropy, what you experience, what wisdom you have about the challenge of leading in crisis, and what you observe in our communal system about our strengths and weaknesses that comes to that part of our work.
Thanks so much, Yehuda. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody. Let me just begin by thanking everybody at the Shalom Hartman Institute for making all this happen. As I'm often prone to say, those of us on this side of the table have the easiest job in the world, and all the hard work gets done by you and all your colleagues in both planning for, canceling, and then replanning and reworking all sorts of activity for the sake of the Jewish people. So we're very grateful to you and to all our grantees for all the work that they're doing in this moment. I think, my answer to your question kind of is in two parts. As you said, I've spent pretty much the last 35 years in Jewish institutional leadership. I was a residential camp director at the age of 23. I often joke that I would never have hired myself. Had I understood the awesomeness of that responsibility, I would have run far away. But being young and immature, I of course just leapt in and said yes. And I think all my strengths as a CEO are related to the fact that I was thrown in at the deep end. And I think every one of my weaknesses is related to the fact that I was thrown in at the deep end and never had the type of mentoring and leadership training programs that you and others have developed over the years. I think the answer is kind of split into two. I think there's leadership up until circa 2016, 2017, and then there's leadership post that. And leadership in crisis up until 2016, 2017, I think was critical and hard work, but it was at best sporadic in its nature. There would be a crisis, we would respond to it, and then we would default back to some sense of normalcy. So, in the sense that in a crisis, a leader must lead, but during all other times, leadership is sometimes leading, and it is sometimes escorting along the way, and it is sometimes actually following. And I think the challenge that has transpired over the last 7 to 8 years has been this constant modality of crisis, which has raised all the kind of hormones in our body to be acting in this consistent fight or flight mode. And that is exhausting and tiring and hard. And at the same time, I posit that it is something that we have to get very used to. I wrote a piece not so long ago about some of the work that was done by a think tank related to the US Army based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, back in the late 80s, where they coined the term VUCA, which stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And they somehow foreshadowed that the world would enter into this phase at some point in the next 15, 20 years. And as I've spoken about before, in 2007, with the advent of the global financial crisis, alongside the invention and release of the first iPhone, globalization and the world's problems began to be cascaded right in front of our eyes at every single moment. And so I sadly have to say in this respect that we have to rewire our brains, which as human beings, we have the ability to do. We have neuroplasticity to allow us to actually act in a normal where crisis management, crisis leadership is a thing that we could actually normalize. We're right at the very beginnings of that, and it is very difficult. But I'm actually already seeing some things that have happened in the last couple of crises where we're acting quicker, we're acting faster, and we've built in some modalities and some processes that allow us to actually carry work forward in a much sharper, quicker time frame. And I'll just finish this piece of it because, we can get into some specifics, I'm sure. I would just say that I think the big challenge that we're facing here in general in our community, not just in crisis management, but just in general, is we've built an incredibly amazing community. And fundamentally, at its core, we have a lot of 20th century institutions being governed by 19th century structures, run by 21st century leaders like you and I and many others who are doing their best, but were fundamentally never really trained for a moment like this. So it's the ultimate example of building a plane while we're flying it. And we have to be able to take a step back and understand what that looks like.
Great. I want to come back to the 20th century institutions, 21st century challenges, but I want to pick up on two things that you said, because they're real concerns of mine in this current Jewish leadership ecosystem. I agree with your diagnosis. I identify with it. That, in fact, I can tell you that for the Hartman Institute, really for the first 30 years of our existence, we were very allergic to the crisis narrative precisely because we felt that it was imposed in places that it didn't belong. In other words, it was a way for certain organizations to argue about a kinds of set of decisions and a decision-making apparatus that didn't befit the nature of the challenges that the Jewish community faced, many of which actually required deliberative thinking, wisdom, a slower pace, and a sense of agency, which actually you feel that you lose in a period of crisis. No, I didn't create this. All I can be is a respondent to something. But you're right, since 2016, I feel not just as someone whose job it is to try to create educational programs that respond to these crises, but also inhabiting a role running a particular institution that has to make its own changes and pivots. Between the Trump election and the turbulence in American democracy, pandemic, October 7th, the Gaza war, and I probably missed a few other along this way, the crisis is now both the stuff of Jewish life and a particular set of challenges that Jewish institutional leaders have to face. And I guess I worry about two things that you said. One is you said we have the neuroplasticity to evolve around this, and I'm not convinced that we do. I'm not convinced that the speed of the assault of information on our brains, that we are actually going to be capable of that kind of neuroplasticity in a short period of time. And that is going to require us to default, as we kind of already do, to previously held narratives and look for information that affirms those narratives. And the other fear that I have is the way that this moment feeds the addiction of those who like this kind of leadership behavior. And the organizations that feed on it. There are organizations that actually do great in periods of crisis because they play on a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety, and they build war rooms, literally war rooms. And so it's like exciting for them to be in this crisis, but that also changes the perception of what Jewish communal life and leadership is about. And it really inferiorizes, it renders as second place a lot of the work that you and I care about, which is like, how do I build Jewish educational resilience for like lifetimes as opposed to like short period of time? So those are the things that kind of worry me. And I'm wondering whether you feel that we're in a better shape to be able to adapt and absorb those issues, or you share those concerns.
Yeah, no, look, I undoubtedly share the concerns. They're very different concerns. And so just to tackle them, separately, on the neuroplasticity piece of the puzzle, look, we as human beings evolve, right? That's what we do. And I do believe that over time we will evolve into this in some fashion, recognizing, by the way, when you said, maybe there's some big events that have happened that we've missed, that I've missed. You talked about COVID and, et cetera, just thinking about everything that's going on in our world, and whether it be, climate change, and other massive macro things that particularly a lot of us, and particularly our young people, are very, very focused on. Yeah, that will evolve over time. And that doesn't mean that there might not be some loss until we catch up, et cetera. I think the challenge around the neuroplasticity is in the makeup of the community. It requires that both from everybody involved in leadership, both professional and lay. And I think there are places that are set up for that more, than others. And yes, I think you're right. I think that for some people, war rooms and action and crisis are very much the engine of their work, the raison d'etre. And I think it is. It doesn't mean that there isn't a place for them, because there is a place for them. But we also have to, those of us that have to push back on some of that, from time to time. And look, you and I often talk about how different and special we think the community is. And then we also realize that we are very similar to everything else that is going on in the world. And so I think beginning to extract and identify why we're in this moment and how we can work together to get out of it is critical. And, I rattle off, things that we know, there's just an erosion of trust in institutions. So that's a factor that speeds crisis and we have to, figure that out. The pithy line that I heard recently: people trust influencers more than institutions. That's, I think, a bit of a reality, and that's
Right.
that's a big problem. A big problem for us. So I think that the neuroplasticity piece of the puzzle will take time, but that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can be doing. And I do believe that being nimble in moments, being good and not perfect, I think is very challenging for some people. It's less challenging for somebody like me because, I think that perfection is the enemy of good. And what you have in processing in your mind, I have in just, an accent, etc. I don't move and think as fast as you and other leaders, but I do believe that I've figured out how to be nimble in this moment. And I think a lot of us have to be much more nimble. I was thinking earlier on today about just tying it to like a little bit of a concrete example. When COVID hit, there's many unsung heroes in the money that went out into the field at that moment. But certainly internally, I always say that the board of the Jim Joseph Foundation was just like an incredible hero at that moment. Because when I came to the board and said, look, we kind of have to suspend how we do things here, and we need an awful lot of money, we need to put it into the field. Yes, we have tremendous assets, but the day that the board said, here's $15 million and go do what you need to do, was actually coincidentally the day in April that the markets were at their lowest point, right? It's just an interesting coincidence. And, the lessons that we learned there have stood us in good stead for October 7th and the tragedies and the response of that. And even in this passing moment, where we have systems and processes in place. So yes, I think these things take time, but I do think there are things that can move into place in a quicker fashion.
Early in my career, I worked with a professional coach, and I was new in this job. Actually, one of the most gracious things that this organization did was I got hired to this job when you were thrown into the deep end of your camp director job at 23. I was hired in this job at 32, and it was my first job. And I thought I was taking a big risk by leaving an academic career, but I think the bigger risk was on the Hartman side. And I knew enough to ask for a coach, and I was grateful that the organization paid for that, but also that, more importantly, that they let me make a bunch of mistakes. But one of the wisdom pieces that I learned from my coach, Ray Ringel, was, she liked using sports metaphors, and she was like, okay, when you're in a position of leadership, you're a quarterback on the field, and your primary job is to filter out the useful noise from the not useful noise. The useful noise might be your coach calling the play in your ear. It might be your teammates. It might be the footsteps of the defensive lineman who's coming here. That's the noise you have to listen for. And the not useful noise is everything else: the hecklers, the crowd in general, the opposing coach, the other players trying to distract you. And the hardest piece of the work is figuring out what's the useful noise and the not useful noise. And I was thinking about that when you talked about the influencer versus institution piece, that so much of the work of leadership now does seem to be atomized more to individuals than institutions. That feels like a pretty dangerous risk for our community right now, where the institutions are not bigger than individuals, that there's a little bit of like a referendum on institutions by the quality of the leader or the quality CEO. And on top of that, the noise climate is so much harder than we've seen before. How are you thinking about that challenge if we want to improve our institutions, right? But we're dependent, actually, it seems, on like unique individuals. What do we do to kind of address that challenge in this climate?
Yeah, it's a great point and a great question. I mean, so look, you're obviously in the leadership game, and we are at the foundation are, big time in the leadership game. And I do believe that ultimately having the right leaders at the top of these institutions, and by that, I don't just mean, the president or the CEO. I'm talking about a set of people at the top, both professionally and lay. Right? Because the way that our community is set up, that requires that holy partnership to work and work beautifully. But until we have the best of the best at the top, I think it's going to be a problem that's going to get harder and harder. And, thinking about what you were talking about, like filtering out the noise, and, I'd written some notes to prep here, for this. And somebody asked me recently, a young professional in the community, and he said to me, what's the one piece of advice that you would give me in order to stick around and, really make a career out of it? And I thought a little bit, and I said something which sounded pithy but was really honest. I said, "Do you remember when you were a little kid, and there was that little bouncy toy that you had that would sit in your basement, and you would push it over with a punch, and it would spring right back up, right?" I said, "Well, that is a quality that we all need, right? Because I sat in your office, a few weeks ago. You weren't having the best day, and I wasn't having the best day, right? On that hour and a half that we spent together, a variety of things were going on in both of our worlds. And yet, here we are, right? We kind of bounce back. And this is not a job for the thin-skinned in leadership. It is just not. If you want to be liked, host a dinner party. Don't lead an institution. Don't lead a community. Don't lead. It requires, I think that, and I do think that, to respond directly to your question, I found it very difficult to tune out that stuff at the beginning. I found it hard to. I wanted to respond. I wanted to take care. I wanted to be liked. If you will. And I think over time, I think kind of there is something to, he says as a, 58-year-old now, there is something about age and wisdom, right? Where you get to a particular point in your career and you realize that, what, this is it, that, this is the time. I used to sit there at the back of rooms when I was in my 20s and 30s. And now we're at the front of the room, right? And what does that mean? And how do we show moral leadership? And how do we move the community forward? I believe very much in institutions. I believe, and I also believe that it's getting harder and harder. And I'll finish with this. I was with a dear friend, Dr. Zohar Raviv, a few months ago when he was in San Francisco. And, I hope I get this right to do it justice. I will never do it as well as he did. But he talked about imagining a triangle. And he said, at the top of the triangle is a piece of information. And if you receive a piece of information, and what do you do when you get a piece of information? You say, oh, that's interesting. I'm going to gain some knowledge about that piece of information. I'm going to speak to experts. I'm going to read some books on it. I'm going to listen to a podcast, and then so you gain some knowledge. And then you take that piece of information, that knowledge that you've gained, and then you put it through your own personal filter. 58-year-old naturalized American citizen, originally from Glasgow, Scotland, growing up in a background, so on and so forth, and you develop an opinion. Well, the problem now is that the opinion is given, which is usually in 240 characters or less, and everybody jumps straight to opinion. And I think those of us that are involved in institutions are guilty of that as well. Right. And we have to somehow get back to the rigor of knowledge. And I think institutions can do that. So it's not just a generational thing where young people are reading stuff on Twitter or on Instagram and developing an opinion. Yes, that is happening, but we're all doing it as well. Right. We're all listening to sound bites and we're all gathering, and we could have a whole podcast about all the reactions to the election on Tuesday night in New York City. And it's just one sound bite after one sound bite after another.
Yeah. We studied this at Hartman a number of years ago, put out a paper which we called Courageous Leadership, the Challenges for Jewish Leaders in a Partisan Era. And one of the things that we observed then, which I think is now even more pronounced, was that one aspect of the talent pipeline challenge in the Jewish community was that talented people did not want the corner office jobs, partly because they saw the way that the political climate was savaging leaders and incentivizing certain kinds of leaders, like the addicts we talked about before. And so if you're an assistant rabbi and what you really wanted to go into this work doing was to give sermons, to visit the sick, to care for people at their deathbeds, but the senior rabbi is spending all of their time managing one political crisis after another. So you stay in the assistant rabbi job. And the same goes for assistant Hillel directors. It changes people's perception of what the field is ultimately about. I can tell you in the pandemic, and then we saw echoes again in our organization, I felt this week. During the pandemic, we canceled 2 straight summers, which meant that a lot of our junior staff, who we know were only going to work at the Institute for a couple of years anyway before they move on to their next thing. That's a success story, actually.
Of course.
It destroyed their time with us, and it shortened their timeline in our organization. Because if you don't get to actually do the work, spend a lot of time planning, but you want to actually see the work. And I have to say, this week in particular, I came out of this week, and one thing I felt for the first time was I think that week shortened my tenure.
Mm.
I'm not going anywhere, and this isn't like a big quitting reveal party, but I felt like it shortened my tenure. There's only so many times you can go through this. And that feels like it's one side of this talent question that we have. We're already dealing with a question of, do we have enough people to do this work and who are going to want to do it? And we're also seeing the way this climate is actually making this work. What can we do as a Jewish community on both challenges, which is both put more people in this system, but also create the conditions where having to lead through crisis doesn't actually, savage our fields?
Yeah, it's to those on now and those listening, this is going to sound like we rehearsed this conversation, and we did not. And so I got a lot to say about both of these. Look, on the second one, the model, that's when I talked about, kind of 20th century institutions and 19th century structures, right? The model of the corner office CEO and she or he, still, sadly, mostly he's, given the amount of she's that are working in the Jewish community far outweighs males. It's not the same job anymore, and therefore the way to solve for that is actually really truly investing in shared and structured leadership models. And I was gifted an amazing 3-month sabbatical. And while I was gone, our team led by Dombeer Novikov, took over. And, I was out, zero contact for 3 months, right? Because you can't say to people, call me for this, don't call me for that. You're either in or you're out. And when I came back and we did a debrief and I talked to the board, I said to our board, I said, look, I was gone for 3 months. You guys made a set of decisions while I was gone. Some, I am sure, were probably better than the ones that I would have made. Some maybe were a little worse than the ones I would have made. The better ones were only slightly better, and the worse ones are only slightly worse. So the reality is, what blind bit of difference did it make, right? So you have 2 options now. You can say, well, we don't need him anymore, and you can save a ton of money, right? That could be an option. Or then you ask yourself the question, what's the best and highest use of leadership teams, right? You can only ask that question when you devolve yourself into some type of shared leadership model, but our governance structures rarely allow for that. Money, no, that's not the way it works in a business. A board member would say there needs to be that, all of that, right? So I think that we're beginning to move into the communities, beginning to realize you're starting to see things like co-rabbis. We had that here in San Francisco at Temple Emmanuel. You're starting to see shared leadership models happen in different places, and I think there's a lot of legs in that kind of stuff, and it needs to be explored more. On the front end, we are not going to get our best and our brightest unless we make the opportunities interesting, full of professional development, full of responsibility, financially able to do it. I think about organizations, particularly those organizations which the vast majority of organizations are on the coasts. Los Angeles, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Boston, New York. These places are just incredibly expensive to live in. And, many times, we don't have the ability to be able to somebody, here's a real living wage. So the prospect of I could do that, or I could go and work somewhere else where, by the way, I'm also going to get my stock options and all, and you're going to feed me every single day, and I can get my hair cut in the barber shop at Apple or whatever. It's very, very difficult to compete with. And I'll finish this part by saying, this is primarily to boards and to donors. You got to get into the overhead game big time, because the staff that is on this call, myself included, we are the raw material that runs the Jewish community. We don't have anything else. We don't have widget. We don't have other raw material. We're not mining for iron and grabbing coal. We're not doing anything. It's us, right? So when we sit around the table and we talk about, well, can we do this or can we do that? It's all down to the quality of our people. And we have to reward them sufficiently. We have to train them sufficiently. And I think, over time, we could make a dent. We've gotten ourselves into a bit of a hole. I think we can get out of that hole, but there's no short-term fix.
So when you go back to what you were talking about before about 20th century institutions, 21st century challenges, I want to wed that to what you just described here. It seems to me that that major institutional family philanthropy, whatever terms we want to use to describe this field, has probably a much bigger role to play than it did 40, 50 years ago. It already plays a much bigger role, and maybe a far bigger role than it's already playing when we talk about these kind of ecosystemic issues around talent and Jewish leadership. I've had mixed experience actually talking with people in philanthropy about this very question, because in general, like, the worst thing you want to say to somebody is that they're the powerful ones. Nobody wants to really hear that. They want to say, oh, who am I? Right? Right. Look who thinks he's, In fact, I once had a conversation with a major funder in a Jewish community in America. And the funders were complaining about some phenomenon that was taking place in their community. And I said, okay, guys, that's interesting. Fix it. And they're like, who are we to fix it? I said to them, who else is in charge? And they're like, they were embarrassed by that, in the sense that, like, they, possessing an immense philanthropic resources, right, we don't want to admit that the ecosystem has changed so significantly that the very institutions that we like to complain about in terms of their failures are partly in that place because of the reallocation of capital, right? So it feels as though one of the recognitions that we have to do to get to a 21st century ecosystem is to figure out where the power base actually lies. And I'm curious for your thoughts on that, as someone who's leading one of the most prominent, most visible Jewish family philanthropic organizations, and one that has a particularly important niche in Jewish education. What are the pieces of systemic change which you think need to be owned disproportionately by philanthropy, given the change in this ecosystem in Jewish life?
Yeah, look, again, appreciate the question. So first of all, we're a community that loves to gestry, right? And there's a tremendous amount of bright spots, right? So, we don't, we're talking an awful lot about problems here, and there are many bright spots. And, it's good. It's important for us all to stop and smell the roses about all the great work that is happening. And I do believe that incrementally, I can point to dozens and dozens of organizations who are moving forward with their work. And at the same time, I hold the dissonance of, I worry that as a community, we're falling behind, which is really strange, right? It's like, this is where the sum of the parts actually that metaphor doesn't work, right? They're actually not greater. They're not working out as greater. There's very few things I know for sure, but one of them I know for sure is the one resource that we have plenty of in the North American Jewish community is money. There is no doubt about that. That we are the most resourced Jewish community in history, and there is literally, billions and billions in dollars are out there. So your analysis is correct, right? It can be solved. And there is this notion and a fine balancing act that I think a lot of philanthropies have to play between imposing will, but also understanding that you do have this little bit of a balcony place that you can see and you can understand, and how do you affect that change? So, a philanthropist coming in and just banging on a door about something and says, here's how to fix it, and we're going to fix it, will ultimately fail, in my opinion, and will ultimately be not a good use of resources. And look, here I will probably do something that maybe you like or don't like, right? But we're working together on a rabbinic ordination program, and it's an interesting example, right? Where we saw something in the field 7-8 years ago. We didn't rush into it immediately. We did some diagnosis. We spoke. We met. We convened. We talked to people, and now we're making a play with our money primarily. But with you and your team, running it, and it's a good example of like a partnership that happened in a very real way. and your team, and Jesse and Lauren and others are running a program, and we're involved in it, but we're not imposing our will on it. And I think that there is, not to pat ourselves in the back, I think there is a model there. However, having said that, it's very difficult in this day and age to tell people what they should or should not do with their money. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to set an example of what we believe is correct. That might not be what is correct, but what we believe is correct, and we're trying to do it with a decent amount of humility. But I do generally agree with your point, Yehuda, that philanthropy needs to take a little bit of a more active role. And I'll finish by saying this is hard. Like, one of the reasons why we chose to do this is because we had the right partner with the Hartman Institute, and it was something that we could just do ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. And we've got incredibly close philanthropic partners, many names that I could run off. But when you get into the bigger, more challenging items, sometimes you just need to drive forward. I have a board member who often says, it sticks with me, and she says, find the white spaces where we think we can make a difference, and go after them. And it's a quality line.
I'm going to ask you one last question, and then we'll open it up for our audience. We've talked a lot here about the process and the ecosystem of leadership, and I want to talk at least one substance piece. You and I spoke a lot in the early moments after October 7th, when October 7th was a seismic event almost in the literal sense, in that there were so many earthquakes afterwards. There were so many, it wasn't clear which were the earthquakes and which were the aftershocks, but there were so many other ways in which the events of October 7th were accelerating trends in American Jewish life, exposing fault lines, if we want to stick with the metaphor, in American Jewish life. And we talked a lot about preparedness or lack thereof in the Jewish community about the clarity of our commitments, right? That we know that not every Jewish organization has to have an explicit statement on Israel. But as a community, there was just a lot of confusion about what we stood for and what we didn't stand for. And we're now watching this recent war again, kind of demonstrating there's a lot of pre-existing biases, right? If you don't trust Netanyahu and Bibi, it's hard to wrap your head around the fact that this might actually have been a good thing for Western civilization and the world, the state of Israel, the future of the region, et cetera. The gaps between American Jews and Israelis are being exposed by this. What are you seeing in terms of our collective capacity or institutional capacity to be able to name and articulate our core commitments? And what do you think we should be working towards to help this field get better at that?
Yeah, it's brutal out there. It just is, and I think it actually speaks to kind of I'll get to the question, but it speaks to the loneliness of leadership, right? For everybody, crisis leadership is thankless and incredibly isolating. You said it yourself a few minutes ago, and I just want to encourage all of us in the room, because we're all leaders. I'm not asking people to be fearless, but you do need to remain present, right? Don't pull yourself out of it. You have to be in it, and you have to be present. Somebody asked me, that same young person who asked me about, what's the one piece of advice? He said to me, "How have you made it so far in your career?" And I said, honestly, I said, you know what? I said, I show up and I answer emails on time. Right. That's 90, showing up is 95% of the game, and answering emails and just being present for people is the other one. It's an incredibly difficult moment. Look, there's enormous fragmentation, and I hesitate to say what I'm about to say, but I'm going to say it. I struggle with the term Jewish community. Right. I'm just really not quite sure what it means. There's no shared baseline for facts, for language, for outrage, as you said. This is where institutions must step up and be trusted conveners. And I think they find it very difficult to do that. They have pressures from their staff. They have pressures for their donor base. I will tell you on a personal level, and you and I have talked about this as well. I've tried to make my own tshuva, in some of my thinking and some of the outrage that I had after October 7th, and some of the people that I just kind of wholly dismissed, as my own, anger and my own Zionism was reflected in how I was thinking. And it's very difficult. That's why I say consistently showing up is critical, because we do move over time. But, if your leadership only works for Jews who look like you, who vote like you, who pray like you, I got to tell you, that's not leadership, in my opinion. But I do fear that we're cascading even more so into fragmented communities. And I've spent a lot of time in the last 2-3 months trying to think of ways to, begin to solve for that. And if it's back to where we started with your sports analogy from Ray, I'll use the American football analogy as much as it pains me being a real football fan. We're at the 1 yard line and we got another 99 to go.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's one other piece to that, which is what I observed was, especially around Israel, around issues of Jewish peoplehood, many Jewish leaders felt thrown into the need to issue a response, issue a statement, fend off criticism, etc., and treated it as a really urgent technical challenge. But what it exposed was, if you haven't figured out what you think about the issue, what you believe in, what your values are, your technical solutions are going to keep striking you, right? So, I worked with one school that simply couldn't figure out how to articulate what they felt about Israel. And I was like, you're not going to be able to withstand this challenge for a long time if you can't find the positive articulation of what you believe in. You're always then going to be playing defense against. So that feels to me like the peacetime moment. Like if we get to a place where there's some peacetime, the work is going to be, don't tell me how you're going to manage the crisis the next time around. Tell me what you believe in, because once you know what you believe in, actually a whole variety of solutions to problems may start to present themselves.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more. And there were a couple of conversations I had with local Bay Area organizations around exactly this. And dealing with staff and different things. I'm like, no, you have to say what it is and who you are. It's okay. You're entitled to do that, right? But trying to do that in a moment of crisis is an absolute recipe. And I love your diagnosis. Like, this is peacetime work. Should we, please God, get there?
Here are some other things that are happening at the Shalom Hartman Institute this week. Join us on Wednesday for a conversation with Daniel Hartman and Yossi Klein Halevi, moderated by Ronit Hid, live from our Beit Midrash in Jerusalem. The virtual event will take place at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Wednesday. A link to register can be found in the show notes. If you love Identity Crisis for the thoughtful conversations around the big questions facing Jewish life, we are excited to tell you about a new podcast from the Shalom Hartman Institute, Future Tense, a show that puts today's biggest Jewish questions in the hands of the leaders of tomorrow. On Future Tense, rising Jewish leaders drive conversations with Hartman scholars like Yehuda Kurtzer, Ilana Stein-Hain, and Masua Sagiv on the most pressing issues facing their generation. The premiere episode of Future Tense, a provocative conversation with Daniel Hartman about pluralism, launches on Monday, July 7th. Subscribe to the Future Tense podcast feed through the link in our show notes to be the first to listen. Thanks for listening to our show, and special thanks to our guest, Barry Finestone. Identity Crisis is produced by me, Tessa Zitter, and our executive producer is Maytal Friedman. This episode was produced with assistance from Annie Beyer-Chaffetz and edited by Gareth Hobbs at Silversound NYC, with music provided by SoCalled. Transcripts of our show are now available on our website typically a week after an episode airs. We're always looking for ideas for what we should cover in future episodes, so if you have a topic you'd like to hear about, or if you have comments about this episode, please write to us at identitycrisis@shalomhartman.org. For more ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute about what's unfolding right now, sign up for our newsletter in the show notes and subscribe to this podcast everywhere podcasts are available. See you next time, and thanks for listening.